All right, guys, let me clonk you over the head with some policy substance here. So you are going to know more about Tim Walz's record and his policies than anybody in the world. I'm about to walk you through just as much as humanly possible of his record and his policies and the kind of politician that he is. So you're already familiar with some of it, but we're going to get a hell of a lot deeper in this segment. So as I told you, day one, as soon as Kamala became the one, if you ask me, hey, who would you have be Kamala's VP? In the whole country, who would you pick? I would have picked Tim Walz over Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie's got issues in terms of age now, obviously, right? If the nominal reason Biden's stepping aside is age, you don't want to replace him with somebody who's older. There's that. But honestly, even from a policy perspective, the thing about Tim Walz that's better than Bernie is that their voting records are similar, but Tim Walz has much better political instincts. And I think he's also a much bigger fighter. So he has this reputation as being bipartisan when he was in Congress. But the thing is, as Tim actually says in his speeches, I learned to compromise without compromising my values, right? Now, again, to be fair, Bernie was called the Amendment King for a very similar reason. But the difference is, I feel like the speeches and the interviews and the debate moments of Tim Walz, he's willing to hit the right harder than Bernie is. Okay, so having said all that, let's dive into it here. As you all know, Tim Walz is by far the best Democratic governor in the country. He had a one-seat majority in Minnesota, and he implemented the following: universal free school meals, legal weed, carbon-free electricity by 2040. He did tax rebates for the working class up to $1,300 if you make under $150,000 a year, 12 weeks paid family leave, 12 weeks paid sick leave. He banned gay conversion therapy because, of course, it doesn't work. He did red flag laws for guns. That means if you are having a mental breakdown, it becomes illegal for them to confiscate your guns until you're no longer having a mental breakdown. Universal background checks for guns. That polls at like 80 or 90%. Automatic voter registration. Free public college if you make under $80,000 a year. He banned the PFAS, which are forever chemicals, which have some health consequences associated with them. He did a $2.2 billion increase in K-12 school funding, and he did sectoral bargaining for nursing home workers, which of course massively raises the wages of nursing home workers. So this is the list that you're familiar with, right? But what you don't know is that when I initially crafted this tweet and came up with this list, it was based on like one or two articles that came out when we were learning about what I'll call the Minnesota miracle, how they just did so many base things in such a short time span. But there's so much more to this guy. So he was also a congressman, right? And this is also only part of his agenda as governor. Okay, so let's dig a little deeper. These are other policies of Tim Walz that I hadn't mentioned in that other tweet, both as a congressman, some as a congressman, and then some as a governor. He opposed the Wall Street bailouts in 2008. This is when he was in Congress. Based. This is like Bernie did it. The libertarians were also on the same side on this one. Basically like, hey, why are we doing socialism for the rich? If anything, we should help out the poor, right? So opposed the Wall Street bailouts, voted against a number of outsourcing deals. And by the way, this is going to become very relevant with some of the lines of attack the Republicans are using on Tim Walz, because he traveled to China a bunch and, he was there for a while, and I think he learned Mandarin, and he's got all these interesting things in his backstory. They're trying to use that to argue, look, he's going to sell out to China. Well, sell out how? And do what? Ship all of our jobs over there? You mean like the establishment politicians did? That he didn't do? Because again, his record is voting against outsourcing deals. Okay, let's continue. 100% rating from Planned Parenthood. He banned non-compete clauses, which are, of course, incredibly predatory. He raised the minimum wage for small businesses, raised taxes on multinational corporations, protected gender-affirming care, banned medical providers from withholding care over debt. He protected construction workers from wage theft, and he did a massive Minnesota infrastructure bill. So more of his agenda. This one is not just as governor, but some of it also is when he was in Congress. Okay, we're still not done yet. So I love this clip. And this is how you know this is a phenomenal choice. Listen to how the business community is talking about him. Here we go.
I can't even begin to imagine what the business community is going to think about a progressive. That's the governor's house.
I can tell you already. I'm literally.
But Andrew, yeah, go ahead.
I'm literally texting with a number of CEOs right now, and not to say that CEOs are an arbiter of anything, but the business community, as you just said, I think was hoping, maybe hoping against hope, that the governor of Pennsylvania would be the vice presidential pick, and that was going to be a larger indicator or signal about how Vice President Harris would govern as president, potentially moving more towards the center as opposed to moving more towards the left. Clearly, it appears at least that this pick, at least in the eyes of the business community, is a signal that, in fact, she may want to govern more from a progressive left standpoint. You know, you talked about Shapiro. His stance on fracking, for example, was something that that the business community thought, okay, we can work with him.
Shapiro also wanted to cut corporate taxes. He supports charter schools. So he has a number of things that show him to be certainly more in the center than on the left.
Given the sort of back and forth now of where Harris has been on fracking, that was going to ultimately help her. I don't think we know enough exactly about this pick's views on certain economic issues.
I love how he says that. It's like, you know, you could have just done research and learned all of it. He says, we don't know enough because I haven't heard other people talk about it and I'm too lazy to do my research. You could just read about it. Oh my God, I hate these people so much. Oh, these are the ones who are in mainstream media. Like the laziest, dumbest characters.
Clearly in this sort of, you know, what is centrist, what's more left, that is the view this morning, at least literally in the minutes that this has been coming out as I've been working my fingers on the phone here.
Andrew, and Andrew, politically, I mean, if you just followed what politicians have been saying in the Democratic Party, he is a darling of progressives. He's a darling of the left. And they were lobbying very hard for a progressive ticket with progressive in the number 1 and a progressive in the number 2 slot. That's exactly what they got.
So to Joe Scarborough's point, believe it or not, it's actually more complicated than that. And you're going to see that a little later on in this segment. The idea that this is only making progressives happy. That is not true. And again, I'll show it to you. And I'll tell you why that's the case also, which is interesting. But we're still not done. Let's continue here. So now, by the way, the point that they made on, the business people are scared. I don't doubt that they feel like that, but anybody slightly to the left of Attila the Hun scares them. All right, so let's be clear about that. In terms of his actual record on business, this guy is definitely a lefty. He's definitely a social democrat. But the idea that he's anti-business is fundamentally untrue. In fact, Minnesota ranks as one of the top states in business. So a lot of businesses are going to Minnesota. So, and again, I'll give you a phenomenal thread. There are different ideological perspectives that you could look at Tim Walz through, and he kind of gives everybody something that's appealing. So here we go. So now let's pivot a little bit to foreign policy. One of the reasons why people on the left were very happy about this is because he is like one of the only elected Democrats in the country who, number one, called for a permanent ceasefire early on in the destruction of Gaza. But more importantly than that, I think he is the only politician, save maybe Rashida Tlaib and a handful of others, who actually defended the voters who went uncommitted instead of voting for Biden in the primary over the issue of Gaza. Watch this.
You've seen in Minnesota during the primary process, some 19% of Democratic primary voters in Minnesota voted for uncommitted rather than for President Biden. That's nearly 46,000 people, largely calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Does Vice President Harris need to change her message, specifically on this one issue, to break from Biden and to try to bring some of those voters back in?
Look, I think she's got an opportunity to show the leadership that we know is there. Look, those folks express their opinion, and I'm proud to be part of a party that doesn't all wear the same red hats and bow down a knee to one guy. They're frustrated by this. I think there's a golden opportunity to recognize we need a two-state solution, that the atrocities of October 7th are painful and they're real, and Israel's right to defend itself is real, but also the situation in Gaza is intolerable. The humanitarian crisis must be brought to an end. So I think having President Harris at a point, bringing folks together, recentering us as a world leader in peace and holding our alliances together, I think she's got a great opportunity, and I remain hopeful that that's the direction we need to go. It's certainly not going to be the failed policies of a wannabe dictator, which we've seen out of President Trump.
So let's be clear about this. He is a Zionist, and literally everybody who is in the running and in contention is a Zionist. I know that doesn't surprise you, but I want to be clear about that. It's not like he's going to go in there and all of a sudden he's fucking Noam Chomsky, right? But his rhetoric on this and his position on this is genuinely more humanitarian than anybody else that's in the running, and arguably almost any other Democratic politicians in the country. He defended the uncommitted voters, and it was a different clip, but he said, look, these people just want to be heard, man, and they're not being heard right now. All right, more. Walz in 2010 voted in favor of a bill passed by the Ag Committee to end all Cuba travel restrictions and allow U.S. farmers to sell food to Cuba directly from U.S. banks on credit terms. In 2015, he co-sponsored the Free Trade with Cuba Act, which would have repealed the embargo. He's in favor of repealing the embargo, getting back to normalization with Cuba, also known as the duh position. It was one of the better things that Obama did, along with the Iran nuclear deal. And he was one of the ones on the right side of that. But I got more for you. So here's on foreign policy. In the House, Walz played a significant role in pushing back against a new war in Syria during both of the major pushes for U.S. involvement in 2013 and 2016. He was also a strong voice in defending Congress's war powers. So in other words, you all know this, the president sometimes is like, I'm just going to do foreign policy on my own and say, actually, I have the authority to do this, even though they don't. It's a constitutional issue, but the courts have interpreted it differently and basically said, yeah, the president kind of does have a lot of leeway on foreign policy to invade basically where the fuck he wants to invade with any slim rationale they want to give. He's one who came up and said, no. If you're declaring war, and I define that rigidly, then you have to come through Congress, and we have to have our say, because we're the people's body. And he was against bombing Syria. Guys, let's be clear. There was absolute panic and hysteria at the moment. And remember, Obama said, there's a red line, and Assad can't cross this red line. And then Assad allegedly crossed the red line, and all of the establishment and all of the military-industrial complex coalesced and said, no, we have to go to war with Syria. And Tim Walz said no. He said, I don't agree with that. This is not a direct threat to our country, and I'm not going to send American men and women to go fight and die for a conflict they can't even explain the first fucking thing about. Walz helped lead a large group of House Democrats to urge Obama to not go to war in Syria, which was critical to undermining pressure that was building on Obama to wage a war he didn't want to fight. The Walz-Conyers Molten letter calling on the Obama administration to continue pursuing a diplomatic solution was right after 50 State Department officials came out urging war. To get a sense of just how pro-war the narrative had become, check out the hit piece that Politico's Nail Tusi did on the letter. Walz pushing back against a new war in Syria in 2013, quote, we have to challenge the administration if we're being true to who we are. It is about constitutional responsibility of the House, and it should not matter who is the occupant in the White House. In other words, I'm going to buck party orthodoxy here. After 12 years of war, the American public has every right to weigh in and expect that their views be represented in Congress, Walz said. But it gets even better, guys. Walz co-sponsored all of the Yemen War Powers resolutions and even co-sponsored a bill opposing the U.S.-backed coup in Honduras. He's against the illegal coups. And the Yemen War Powers resolution, remember, guys, we were arming and funding Saudi Arabia, and they were doing a genocide in Yemen. Tim Walz said, no, I don't want to do that. I think that's bad. On Cuba, Walz opposed aspects of Trump's policy, calling it short-sighted and misguided. He focused on opening markets for agricultural trade to benefit both Minnesota farmers and the Cuban people. This is him saying war powers is very important. It's with Congress, and so the president cannot act unilaterally. Now we have Walz on the Iran deal in 2015. Former Secretary of State Colin Powell, Iran agreement, a good deal with very vigorous verification. None of our options are gone. He was an early supporter of the Iran deal as well. And that's more on this here. Walz was an early and vocal supporter of the nuclear deal with Iran. Remember, the hardliners and the liberal interventionists, they were not in favor of this. There were a lot of Democrats who were not in favor of this. Walz was on the right side. Then we also have this. Minnesota has been leading the nation in passing new antitrust legislation. Last year, for example, a new law that bans hospital mergers unless they are in the public interest. So he's a trust buster. So that would continue with some of the work that the Biden administration has done on these issues and having people like Lena Khan in power. All right. One important note about Tim Walz is that when he was in Congress, he voted against giving Obama fast-track authority to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As you all know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a fucking mess, to say the least. It was quite literally written by corporate lobbyists. And it's a trade deal that, of course, was very friendly to corporations and billionaires, and it was horrible for workers. Tim Walz was against this. There will be a lot of commentary framing Tim Walz as a pick meant to please the progressive base. But this person here is a self-identified pro-market moderate, and I'm a big fan of this pick too. What? Here's a brief list of what I like about him. Okay, so again, the lefties, the progressives, the social democrats, the socialists, they like this guy for understandable reasons, a lot of the reasons I just went through, right? But there's also an argument in favor of him from literally a neoliberal perspective. Here we go. Listen to this. And to be clear, this guy's an ideological neoliberal. He's not a neoliberal because he was bought by corporations and he's just doing their bidding. Okay, here we go. There's a real difference there, right? Somebody who's actually ideologically genuinely has the position is somebody you can have a conversation with versus somebody who was bought to express that position. Those are different things. Okay. He signed the country's most comprehensive right to repair law. These laws give consumers over where and how to repair their purchases. So you guys have heard about right to repair. Super important. In some places you have to literally bring like your tractor back to John Deere and they get to repair it, and it's much more costly and expensive and time consuming. And this allows them, no, you have a right to repair. You could repair it on your own if you want. Okay. He continues. He's proud of the state attracting business. This is not a billionaire tears, anti-business, harangue on capital kind of guy, at least not as far as I can tell. And that's important to me. He continues. He signed a $100 million tax cut that also simplified the tax filing system in Minnesota, and he brags about tax cutting as part of his accomplishments. That's cool. This is tax cuts for working families and the middle class. This is a position I have as well. I'm totally fine with cutting taxes for working people, for the middle class and the poor. What I'm against is cutting taxes on the wealthy. This is exactly Tim Walz's position. He did raise taxes on corporations, but he didn't raise it on working class families. And this guy's saying, look, that's a nuanced perspective. I appreciate that perspective. Okay, here we go. He signed green energy permitting reforms, supported refugee resettlement, banned non-compete agreements that curtail workers' economic liberty, and has strongly supported workforce development, which helps businesses and workers. Where he most leans toward expanding the state, it's in areas like universal school lunches, more pre-K, and paid family leave that are the exact areas where I'm totally cool with state expansion. So that's what this guy's saying. He's saying the ways in which you're doing interventions into the marketplace are ways I can get behind it. It's not ways that I think are detrimental to the private sector and prevents it from expanding. Okay. And then he just goes on to say, I didn't know much about Walz a month ago, but as it became clear he was a major VP candidate, I looked more into him. I'm sure there will be areas where I disagree with him, but overall, I like what I see. This is the famous picture when he signed free school lunches and free school breakfast, both of them. Free school meals, period. This was the picture he took. And a lot of people compare and contrast this with Sarah Huckabee Sanders signing a law that like rolls back some child labor protections, and the kids are standing around her stone face like, what the fuck? I'm still not done, man. Holy shit. Here we go. Let's continue. In 2009, Walz pushed to lift the Minnesota ban on nuclear power, and last year threw his weight behind a study to looking into new reactors. So the reason why this is important is because many experts believe you can't really get to zero carbon emissions unless you use nuclear at this point in time. That, the ability of other green and renewable technologies to totally fill the gap of fossil fuels, we're just not there yet in terms of capacity, in terms of ability. So you're going to need to lean on nuclear to one extent or another. And so the point is, he's not anti-nuclear. Now, look, me personally, I'm a little more mixed on the issue than he is. I understand the downsides of nuclear. 99% of the time, everything's totally fine, 99.9% of the time. But then in those small cases, like things can go to utter hell. Three Mile Island is, of course, one example. Chernobyl is another example. But it just shows that he's not like a rigid ideologue in the sense that I'm going to write off things that I shouldn't be writing off. Okay, more. He's a big nuclear proponent. More. Now we're just getting into some funny stuff. Last year, Tim Walz declared July 20th as Beyonce Day in Minnesota to celebrate her arrival for the Renaissance Tour. I might be governor of Minnesota, but we all know who runs the world. Welcome to Minnesota, Beyonce. All right, so look, finger on the pulse of the kids, if you will, right? My favorite Tim Walz fact is that he named a highway after Prince and signed the bill in purple ink. What the fuck? Oh, man. All right. So now let's get to this. Now, the right loves pointing out like, oh, you had the riots in Minnesota over the George Floyd thing. But what a lot of people don't know is that there wouldn't have been justice for George Floyd if it wasn't for Tim Walz. Watch this.
I was just on the phone with Attorney General Keith Ellison, who is the Attorney General of Minnesota, and he told me that he thought this was a brilliant And he said it's because even though Minnesota has been a blue state for a long time, they work at it each and every year. He said it's not easy, but we know how to win. We knock on doors, we bring people together. And he said Tim Walz being at the top of that ticket has been instrumental in them keeping that state, that Midwestern state, blue. The other thing I want to note here is that Keith Ellison was telling me that Tim Walz's background is very progressive and also very connected to civil rights leaders. He talked about the George Floyd case. He said if it was not for Tim Walz, there would be no prosecution in the George Floyd murder case. He said in particular that his decision to take that case out of a county prosecutor's hand and into the attorney general's hand ensured justice for the George Floyd family. He said that it also showed that he personally cared about that family. He also talked about the fact that Tim Walz has done things like have universal lunch for the state.
So yeah, if he didn't make that move, there probably wouldn't have been justice for George Floyd. Okay. I mean, the things are just piling up, bro. I don't know what you want me to tell you. So this is when he first ran for Congress in 2006. This was a radio ad that he had. Listen to this.
Hi, my name is Tim Walz, and I'm running for Congress here in southern Minnesota for several important reasons. But today I'd like to tell you about one issue that's very personal to me. I am a retired command sergeant major in the Minnesota National Guard, and after years of firing artillery, I sustained severe inner ear damage. Because I have good health insurance provided through my employer, I was able to have surgery on my ear. As my ear healed, my hearing was gradually restored. One morning, several weeks after the surgery, I awoke to a sound I couldn't identify. I asked my wife what I was hearing, and she told me, "Tim, that's your 4-year-old daughter, Hope. You see, Hope wakes up singing every morning, but I had never heard that sound until that day." I'm running for Congress because I believe we as a country have a moral obligation to ensure that every father can hear his daughter sing, that every citizen receives the best care our medical community has to offer. I'm Tim Walz, and I approve this message because I've heard how important healthcare is to everyone.
Finger on the pulse of these serious and important issues, telling an emotional story about something in his life that his health insurance and his healthcare was able to help him with, and saying everybody deserves this. In one of the most improbable runs in recent political history, Tim Walz is the VP nominee. This is from David Dayen of the American Prospect. I wrote about why he was selected. I don't think it was just his weird argument against Republicans. His legislative record in 2023 in Minnesota mirrors what Kamala Harris wants to get done. Well, if Kamala Harris wants to do what he did in Minnesota, then sign me the fuck up. Because, again, most based governor in the country, and it's not even close. So I guess time will tell, right? But that's a phenomenal sign. It's a great sign. All right, here we go. Now, Nancy Pelosi goes on Morning Joe. Now, understand, Morning Joe, they've been skeptical of Walz. They wanted Shapiro. Morning Joe is really the epicenter of the establishment. They are a conventional wisdom factory. And Nancy, let's keep it real. Nancy has been racking up some W's recently, right? She was allegedly one of the people behind the scenes who effectively were able to force Biden out. She also backed this Democratic socialist in a race in California that made everybody go like, what the fuck? Like, where did this Nancy Pelosi come from? And then now she goes on Morning Joe and she's trying to talk these idiots down off the ledge. And she makes the argument, look, this guy's not far lefty. This guy's a moderate. All right, let's watch and then I'll give you my take on this.
Tim Walz is wonderful. And she had many good choices among the 6 and certainly among the 2. I'm a big fan of Governor Shapiro. Tim Walz, I know very well. He served in the House. To characterize him as left is so unreal. It's just not what the question. He's right down the middle. He's a Heartland of America Democrat, and he was the chair of our Veterans Affairs Committee. And I don't want anybody to forget that because he made tremendous gains for our veterans, working with our folks on the Appropriations Committee and with the Speaker. We made more progress than had ever been made in the history of our country since the GI Bill.
So she goes on, but that's the gist of it. The gist of it is, guys, shut the fuck up. He's moderate. He's down the middle. Now, what's my take on this? Look, there are 2 definitions of centrism. One definition of being a centrist or a moderate is like, yeah, you're down the middle of the sensibilities in the Washington, D.C. establishment. That kind of moderate is terrifying and evil. Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, those kinds of moderates, right? There's another kind of moderate / centrist. I'm right in the center of mainstream American opinion. I'm a moderate amidst the opinions of the American people. And those kinds of moderates are 100% correct. They're in favor of raising taxes on the wealthy, raising the minimum wage, universal free school meals, healthcare for everybody, things of that nature, right? So look, the fact of the matter is, Tim Walz, it's true that he has politics that are very, very similar to Bernie Sanders. He's a social democrat. But at the same time, I love that Nancy Pelosi's out there saying, no, he's moderate. Shut the fuck up, he's moderate. He's moderate. Because that's what we need to do is redefine Tim Walz politics as, no, this is true moderation. The idea that what? The Republicans are moderate? They're out there trying to ban abortion and ban IVF and ban pornography and give more money to billionaires. And like, what are we talking about here? This is insane. No, Tim Walz is a moderate. His voting record is very similar to that of Bernie Sanders. But I am more than happy and more than comfortable to call that a moderate. And if Nancy Pelosi wants to go out and make that argument that he's a moderate and also support Tim Walz, as she clearly does, I'm your huckleberry all day. Do that. But look, the more important point is this. Why is she so vociferously defending Tim Walz? Everything I've read seems to indicate people just really fucking like him interpersonally. They just really like him. He's just a really sweet guy. He's a really nice guy. He makes people feel comfortable. And so Nancy, look, fell for his sweet-ass personality. She's like, I don't even care that you have the politics of Bernie Sanders. I just like you, right? So you're a moderate. And that's the other thing is, a lot of this is vibes-based. And the fact of the matter is, an old white guy from the Midwest with white hair, who's like folksy and talks in a common sense way and he's down to earth, everybody's just going to default like, yeah, no, he's moderate. Like that's what people are going to think. An old folksy white guy who's a football coach and a teacher and was in the military, he's moderate. He's moderate. So if that's how people want to think, by all means. All right, still not done yet. I love this. So from Energimentum, he says, I've been surprised that more Walz proponents haven't brought up this part of his career. Listen to this. Absent a landslide, sophomore performance in 2008, wherein the freshman congressman would ride a national Democratic wave to win by 30 points, Walz would spend the next 4 cycles fighting for his life and coming out on top. He survived the 2010 Republican landslide by a 5-point margin. That was the Tea Party wave. And he was in a red district, very impressively. Still outran Obama's 2008 margin in the district. He would win by 15 points in 2012, while Obama only won his district by just over 1 point. And he would come out of the 2014 red wave 2 years later unscathed, winning by 9. But his most impressive victory of all may have come in 2016, when he survived a gargantuan 17-point rightward shift in his district at the presidential level to hold on to his seat. Every single one of these performances were stellar, and they paint a picture of a politician who, at least for a time, had a very real appeal in a very working-class district that most other Democrats couldn't even come close. Guys, this busts up the bullshit narrative that in order for Democrats to win in red districts, they have to be like Joe Manchin. They have to be total fucking corporate hacks. No, he's the opposite of a corporate hack, and he won by comfortable margins. This is the most important point here. Both Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Joe Manchin came out with enthusiastic praise of Tim Walz as VP. Incredible. How did he unify the party so thoroughly? Well, AOC knows his record in Minnesota, knows the base things he did, like free school meals and things of that nature. And Joe Manchin knows the guy, likes the guy interpersonally, and might look at things like that thread I gave you about the neoliberal who supports him. Like, yeah, okay, he's in favor of cutting taxes for working class people. I like it. He ranks high in businesses coming to the state. I like it, right? How the fuck can you get AOC and Joe Manchin to support you? Both of them to support you. This is some magical ass shit, bro. This is some magical shit. By far, he's the best pick. Now, look, I don't want to make it seem like he's perfect, because he's not. In fact, there's one policy that I didn't like, which is they were working on a bill to make it so that Uber employees are not the independent contractors. The whole reason they have that category is to like skirt around labor laws, right? So they were working on a bill to say Uber drivers no longer are independent contractors, they're employees, and so they get more labor protections. But what happened in that moment is Uber came to Tim Walz and said, if you do this, we are pulling Uber out of the state. So you're not doing this. And Tim Walz said, all right, look, I'll live to fight another day. I want to pass this bill, but I can't. I don't want to risk losing Uber in the state of Minnesota. So, we'll come back to this at a different time. So there are things he did where it's like, that wasn't really the right decision, but you can still theoretically understand where he's coming from in that scenario, right? But he's not going to be perfect. He's going to disappoint us from time to time. But the fact of the matter is, without a doubt, he was the best pick by far, and it's not even close. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.